The static crackled through Corporal Thomas Nez's headset at 6:13 a.m., June 4, 1942, like the sound of his grandmother grinding corn on the reservation. Rhythmic, purposeful, alive with meaning others couldn't hear. His fingers rested on the radio transmitter aboard the USS Enterprise, poised over the encryption pad that represented something no Japanese cryptographer had ever encountered. A code built not from mathematics or mechanical rotors, but from the ancient syntax of Diné-Bizaad, the Navajo language that had survived Spanish conquistadors, American expansion, and government schools that had tried to erase it from his tongue. Through the porthole of the communications room, the pre-dawn Pacific stretched black and empty. But Nez knew better. Somewhere 350 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, the largest naval armada Imperial Japan had ever assembled was steaming through those same waters toward what Admiral Yamamoto believed would be the decisive battle that would break American resolve and secure Japanese dominance of the Pacific. They had no idea they were sailing into a meticulously prepared trap. "We've got confirmation from PBY Patrol." Lieutenant Commander Harrison's voice cut through the ambient noise of the carrier's Combat Information Center. 4 carriers, 2 battleships, support cruisers. They're exactly where HIPO said they'd be. He turned to Nez, his face drawn tight with the weight of command. "We need those coordinates transmitted to Hornet and Yorktown. Now, before they get within strike range of Midway." Nez's hand moved to the microphone, but Radio Man Second Class McCarthy grabbed his wrist. "Sir, we've been transmitting in this language for 3 hours now. What if it's not working? What if our own ships can't decode it fast enough? We should use standard encryption, just to be—" "Standard encryption?" Harrison's laugh was bitter. "The Japanese have been reading our mail for 6 months, McCarthy. They knew we were coming to the Coral Sea. They intercepted our supply convoy routes. They've cracked every code, every cipher, every system we've thrown at them." He gestured to Nez. "Except this one, because this one isn't built from numbers and patterns. It's built from a language that doesn't have a written form, doesn't follow Indo-European grammar, and sure as hell isn't in any Japanese code-breaking manual." The intelligence had been ironclad. Japanese cryptographers, the finest in the world, had spent the last week frantically trying to decipher American transmissions that sounded like nothing in their linguistic databases. Intercepts from Japanese signals intelligence showed increasing desperation. Unknown native language, possibly encrypted indigenous dialect, recommend that enemy awareness of our position is unlikely. They had been listening to Navajo Code Talkers coordinate the entire American defensive strategy and had dismissed it as unintelligible noise. Nez lifted the microphone, feeling the familiar texture against his palm. The same kind of hope and fear he'd felt the first time he'd spoken his native language after years of forced silence in the government boarding school. Back then, a teacher had slapped him for using words his ancestors had spoken for 1,000 years. Now, Admiral Nimitz himself had personally requested those same words. "Enterprise to Hornet," he spoke into the microphone, his voice shifting into the flowing consonants and glottal stops of Diné-Bizaad. "Dibe Yazi, Klizi, Tkun, Shush, Moasi." Each word was layered. First, the Navajo term, then its assigned military meaning in the code he and 28 other Navajo Marines had developed. Sheep lamb meant destroyer. Chicken hawk meant dive bomber. Whale meant battleship. But it went deeper. The grammar itself was altered, words deliberately scrambled in ways that sounded natural to Navajo speakers, but would be impossible for outsiders to reconstruct. Through his headset, he heard the immediate response from Howard Billy, his cousin and fellow code talker aboard the Hornet. "Hagune. Received and understood. Coordinates confirmed." 3 seconds. The message had taken 3 seconds to transmit and confirm. The previous encryption system took 6 minutes, an eternity in naval combat. Harrison exhaled. All stations are receiving. Fletcher has the position. They're vectoring strike craft now. Nez set down the microphone, but his hand trembled slightly. Not from fear of the enemy, but from the staggering weight of irony. The same government that had tried to erase his language, that had punished him for speaking it, that had told him it was savage and worthless, was now depending on it to survive the most critical naval battle in American history. McCarthy was staring at him with something between awe and disbelief. They really can't break it? The Japanese? They can break codes, Nez replied quietly. But you can't break a language you don't know exists. Outside, the first rays of sunlight began touching the horizon, and somewhere in that growing light, Japanese carriers were preparing to launch their strike craft toward Midway, unaware that American dive bombers were already climbing into the sky, guided by words spoken in a tongue older than any empire. September 12, 1931. Tuba City, boarding school, Arizona. Thomas Nez was 7 years old when they washed his mouth out with lye soap for speaking his native language. The burn lingered for days, but not as long as the shame in his teacher's eyes when she'd grabbed his jaw and hissed, "Civilized children speak English." The Tuba City Indian boarding school sat like a fortress against the red rock landscape of the Navajo Nation. Its mission explicit and brutal: kill the Indian, save the man. Thomas had been forcibly removed from his family's hogan 3 months earlier, his hair shorn, his traditional clothing replaced with stiff wool uniforms that chafed against skin unused to such confinement. His grandmother, Astom-on-Sani, had warned him before the federal agents came. "They will try to take your words," she'd said, her weathered hands cupping his face. "But words are like water in the desert. They find ways to survive, even when everything else dies." In the dormitory at night, Thomas and the other Navajo children would whisper their language under threadbare blankets, keeping it alive in the darkness where the teachers couldn't hear. They turned it into a game of survival. Each word remembered was a small act of defiance. Each phrase exchanged was proof that erasure wasn't absolute. The irony was geographic and profound. The same government operating these assimilation schools controlled a territory where Navajo land held strategic value. The reservation sprawled across Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, land rich in uranium, coal, and geographical positioning. Yet the people who'd inhabited it for centuries were considered obstacles to progress, their language deemed worthless. Thomas excelled at English because he had to. He memorized conjugations, absorbed syntax, learned to speak without the tonal inflections that marked him as different. But in his mind, he translated everything back to Navajo, creating a private bilingual world where both tongues existed simultaneously. His teacher, Miss Patterson, noticed his aptitude. "You see, Thomas? Isn't English so much more efficient than that primitive language? Think of all the opportunities available to you now." But Thomas thought, instead of his grandfather teaching him the creation stories in words that had no English equivalent, hojo, a concept meaning beauty, balance, harmony, order, couldn't be translated. It had to be understood through the language that created it. By 1938, when Thomas was 14, the assimilation efforts had intensified. The Bureau of Indian Affairs pushed harder, convinced that native languages were dying curiosities, relics of a vanishing world. Federal policy explicitly forbade their use in schools. Students caught speaking tribal languages faced punishment, ranging from beatings to solitary confinement. Yet Navajo persisted. It persisted because grandmothers like Astzon-on-Sani continued teaching it during summer returns home. It persisted because the language encoded knowledge about the land, about survival, about community structures that couldn't be replicated in English. It persisted because young people like Thomas understood, even then, that losing your language meant losing your ability to think in certain ways. When Thomas graduated in 1940, He returned to the reservation fluent in both worlds, but belonging fully to neither. The Anglo world saw him as Indian. The traditional Navajo world saw him as corrupted by white education. He worked odd jobs, construction, ranching, mechanics, and wondered what purpose his bilingual existence served. Then came December 7, 1941. The radio announcement crackled through the trading post where Thomas was buying supplies. Pearl Harbor. Massive casualties. America at war. In the stunned silence that followed, Thomas felt something shift inside him. The country that had tried to erase his identity was now asking for his service. He enlisted the next morning, walking 12 miles to the recruitment office in Flagstaff. The recruiter barely looked up. "You speak English?" "Yes, sir," Thomas replied. "And Navajo." The recruiter made a notation and handed him enlistment papers. Neither of them knew that a second language would matter. Neither of them could imagine that the tongue the government had spent decades trying to eliminate would soon become the military's most valuable asset. January 8, 1942. Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego. The Pacific War was going catastrophically wrong, and every Marine at boot camp could feel it in the instructors' voices, in the accelerated training schedule, in the desperate quality of the radio reports that filtered through camp. Thomas Nez stood at attention in the California sun, one of 47 Navajo recruits in his training battalion, while Gunnery Sergeant Hawkins paced before them with the coiled tension of a man watching his world collapse. "The Philippines are falling," Hawkins announced without preamble. "Wake Island is gone. Guam is gone. The Japanese Navy controls everything from the Solomon Islands to the Aleutians." He stopped pacing, his jaw tight. "And you know why? Because they know exactly where we're going before we get there." The recruits shifted uncomfortably. Everyone had heard the rumors. Japanese forces anticipating American movements with uncanny precision. Supply convoys intercepted. Defensive positions pre-targeted. The implication was inescapable. The Japanese were reading American communications. "Our encryption is worthless," Hawkins continued. "The Japanese have linguists who studied at Oxford and Harvard. They've cracked our codes faster than we can create new ones. Every message we send might as well be broadcast in the clear." Thomas thought of the lye soap, the punishments, the systemic effort to eliminate indigenous languages. He wondered if anyone in command understood the irony, that the very linguistic diversity they'd tried to destroy might have value in a world where common languages were compromised. After formation, Thomas and 3 other Navajo Marines, John Benally, Wilson Price, and Samuel Begay, gathered near the barracks. They spoke in English, habit and caution ingrained from years of suppression, but Benally switched to Navajo mid-sentence, a small rebellion. "Neo shi dine e bina ada outso zigi ba dahane," he said. The Air Force is struggling with coordination. An Anglo-Marine passing by stopped, staring. "What the hell language is that?" "Navajo," Thomas replied evenly. "Sounds like gibberish," the Marine muttered, and walked away. Samuel Begay laughed quietly after he left. Gibberish that could win a war, if anyone was smart enough to use it. It was meant as a joke, but Thomas felt the idea take root. Languages the enemy couldn't comprehend. Communication that couldn't be intercepted meaningfully, even if it was heard. What if the very obscurity that had marginalized them was actually a strategic advantage? But the military machine had no space for such suggestions from newly minted privates. Training intensified. Thomas learned weapons systems, amphibious assault tactics, radio operation. His aptitude for radio work got him flagged for communications specialization. His steady hands and quick mind suited to the technical demands of field transmissions. The war news grew worse. The Battle of the Java Sea. Allied defeat. Bataan surrendered. The Japanese controlled the Pacific with an iron grip, their naval superiority absolute, their intelligence capabilities proving devastatingly effective. In the communications tent during training, Thomas watched instructors struggle with encryption devices, complex mechanical systems that required minutes to encode and decode simple messages. In combat conditions, those minutes meant death. "Too slow," the instructor complained, slamming the encryption machine. "By the time this message is decoded, the tactical situation has already changed." Thomas wanted to say something, to suggest what seemed obvious to him, but the hierarchy was absolute. Privates didn't advise officers on strategy, yet someone, somewhere, was thinking along similar lines. On February 28, 1942, Thomas and the other Navajo recruits were abruptly pulled from standard training and assembled in a private briefing room. A civilian stood at the front, tall, weathered, with the bearing of someone who'd spent time in the Southwest. "My name is Philip Johnston," the man began, "and I'm about to make you the strangest offer you've ever heard." February 28, 1942, Camp Elliott, California. Philip Johnston looked at the 29 assembled Navajo recruits with the intensity of a man who'd been told his idea was insane. So many times he'd stopped caring. Behind him stood Major General Clayton Vogel, skeptical but desperate enough to listen. "I grew up on the Navajo reservation," Johnston began, his voice carrying the flat certainty of expertise. "My parents were missionaries. I spoke Navajo before I spoke English." He paused, letting that sink in. "I'm one of perhaps 30 non-Navajos in the entire world who can speak your language fluently. And I'm here to tell you that this," he gestured to the group, "is a weapon the Japanese cannot defend against." Thomas exchanged glances with John Benally. This white man spoke better Navajo than some of the recruits. Johnston continued, switching seamlessly to Navajo. "Di behazani ye adahodidlohigi I dautago ba dahane." This language can be used for military communications. Several recruits sat up straighter. General Vogel frowned. "What did you just say?" "That's exactly my point," Johnston replied, switching back to English. "You didn't understand a word. Neither will the Japanese, neither will the Germans, neither will anyone except the people in this room." He explained his reasoning with methodical precision. Navajo was unwritten, grammatically complex, and spoken by fewer than 30,000 people, almost none of whom lived outside the American Southwest. It had no alphabet, no linguistic relationship to German, Japanese, or any Asian language. Japanese cryptographers, brilliant as they were, would have no framework for even beginning to analyze it. During World War I, Johnston said, the Army experimented with Choctaw telephone operators on the Western Front. It worked for about 3 days until the Germans captured a Choctaw soldier and forced him to translate. But here's the crucial difference. There are no Navajo speakers in the Axis powers. None. The language has never been studied by foreign linguists. It doesn't exist in their intelligence databases. General Vogel remained unconvinced. Even if the Japanese can't understand the language, can your people transmit military information fast enough? Can they handle technical terminology? That's what we're about to find out, Johnston said. He turned to the recruits. I need volunteers for a demonstration. We're going to create a code within your language, a military vocabulary using Navajo words to represent things that don't exist in traditional Navajo life. Thanks. Bombers, submarines, artillery coordinates. Thomas raised his hand, followed by Benally, Wilson Price, Samuel Begay, and 25 others. Every single recruit volunteered. For the next 6 days, in a secured room under armed guard, they built a weapon from words. The process was ingenious. For military equipment, they used Navajo nature terms. A bomber became Jay-Show, buzzard. A submarine became Beshlo, iron fish. A battleship became lotso, a whale. Fighter planes were dahetihi, hummingbirds. As for the alphabet, necessary for spelling out names and places, they assigned Navajo words to each letter. A became wolachi, ant. B became shush, bear. The code had multiple words for frequently used letters to prevent pattern recognition. But the true sophistication came from Thomas's suggestion on the third day: grammatical obfuscation. We should scramble the syntax, he proposed. If someone did capture one of us, they'd hear what sounds like standard Navajo, but the word order would be altered in ways that sound natural but mean something completely different. Johnston grinned. You've just added a second layer of encryption. Even a Navajo speaker working for the enemy would hear gibberish, unless they knew the specific military grammatical structure. On March 6th, they demonstrated for a room of skeptical Marine Corps brass. Thomas stood at a radio transmitter on one side of the base, John Benally on the other, 3 miles away. An officer handed Thomas a written message. Enemy forces observed advancing from coordinates 34.2, 118.6. Request immediate artillery support. 2 battalions of infantry. Estimated strength 600. Thomas translated it into code and transmitted it in Navajo. 20 seconds. Benally decoded it and handed the English translation to the receiving officer. Perfect accuracy. The message would have taken 4 hours using standard encryption machines. An Army intelligence officer who'd been invited to attempt breaking the code sat at a monitoring station with recording equipment. After listening to the transmission 3 times, he shook his head. I can't even identify the language family. It could be anything from Tibetan to an African language. This is completely unbreakable by conventional cryptanalysis. General Vogel's skepticism evaporated. How many Navajo Marines can we recruit? Hundreds, Johnston replied. Maybe more. Get me 400, Vogel ordered, and get this program classified at the highest level. If the Japanese find out we're doing this... He didn't need to finish. Everyone understood. The code's power lay in its obscurity. The moment the enemy knew to look for Navajo speakers, the advantage disappeared. Thomas felt the weight of it settling on his shoulders. His language, beaten out of him, shamed, suppressed, was now classified military intelligence. The thing that had made him a target of discrimination was now the thing that made him invaluable. April 15, 1942. Camp Pendleton, California. The Code School was unlike anything the Marine Corps had ever created. A classified facility where language became weaponry, and cultural knowledge transformed into tactical advantage. Thomas Nez and the expanding group of Navajo recruits, now numbering 183, trained 16 hours a day in a regimen that merged traditional military discipline with linguistic innovation. Master Sergeant McCann, a communications specialist with 3 combat tours, addressed the Code Talkers with frank assessment. Every radio transmission you make will be monitored by the enemy. They will record you. They will analyze you. They will bring their best cryptographers to bear on breaking you. He paused. Your job is to make that impossible. The training split into 3 components: military communications protocol, code expansion, and speed transmission under combat conditions. The code vocabulary grew exponentially. Beyond simple equipment designations, they needed terms for tactical concepts, geographical features, rank structures, and temporal elements. The original 211 terms expanded to 411, each carefully chosen to be both memorable to Navajo speakers and completely opaque to outsiders. Thomas specialized in developing geographical encoding. Mountains could mean different elevations depending on which Navajo word was used. Zil indicated peaks above 8,000 feet, while Da'istwo suggested rolling hills. This granularity gave commanders precise terrain intelligence from a single word. But the true test came from an unexpected source: Marine intelligence invited Army cryptographers, American codebreakers, to attempt to crack Navajo transmissions. On April 29th, in a controlled exercise, Thomas and 5 other code talkers transmitted tactical messages while Army signals intelligence recorded every word. The Army team, considered among the finest crypt analysts in the nation, had full access to the recordings, unlimited time, and instructions to break the code by any means necessary. 3 weeks later, the Army team admitted defeat. "We can't even establish a baseline," their lead analyst reported. "The phonetic structure doesn't match any known language in our databases. The syntax appears to shift randomly. There's no pattern repetition we can exploit. If we didn't know this was human speech, we'd classify it as mechanical noise." One frustrated Army lieutenant asked Thomas directly, "How do you remember it all? There are no written references, no code books to consult in the field." "The code is the language," Thomas explained. "We've spoken Navajo our entire lives. These aren't arbitrary assignments we've memorized. They're words that carry meaning in our culture. A turtle is a tank because both have protective shells. A hummingbird is a fighter plane because both are small and fast. The logic is cultural, not mathematical. You can't crack it because you can't think like us." The training escalated to combat simulation. Code talkers practiced transmitting under artillery fire simulation, in smoke-filled rooms, while physically exhausted, under psychological pressure. The standard became perfection. 100% accuracy at maximum speed, regardless of conditions. Thomas discovered he could transmit a 3-line tactical message in 40 seconds that would take conventional encryption systems 30 minutes. The speed differential wasn't just impressive, it was strategically decisive. In naval combat, where positions changed by the minute, 40 seconds versus 30 minutes meant the difference between hitting a target and hitting empty ocean. By mid-May, Marine commanders recognized they'd created something unprecedented. The code talkers weren't just encrypted communicators, they were a communication paradigm that rendered enemy signals intelligence obsolete. But one critical test remained: deployment against an actual enemy attempting real-time interception. The opportunity came from naval intelligence, specifically from Station High IPO in Pearl Harbor, the code-breaking unit that had partially cracked Japanese naval codes. Commander Joseph Rochefort, HIPO's brilliant and eccentric leader, had intercepted increased Japanese radio activity, suggesting a major operation was imminent. "We've broken enough of their code to know they're planning something big," Rochefort told the assembled code talkers via secure connection. "Target designated AF. We think it's Midway, but we need confirmation. More importantly, we need to coordinate our response without them knowing we're coordinating." Thomas felt the stakes crystallize. This was no longer training. Japanese intelligence would be listening, recording, analyzing every American transmission. If the code failed, if Japanese cryptographers found even a foothold for analysis, the entire defensive strategy would collapse. "When do we deploy?" Thomas asked. "Immediately," came the reply. "You ship out to Pearl Harbor tomorrow. From there, career assignments. Gentlemen, if this works, you'll help us win the first major American victory of the Pacific War." That night, Thomas lay in his bunk thinking about his grandmother's words. "Words are like water in the desert. They find ways to survive." She'd meant it as comfort during assimilation's worst abuses. She couldn't have known those same words would flow across radio waves above the Pacific, guiding American forces toward a battle that would change the course of history. May 28, 1942. Station HYPO. Pearl Harbor Commander Joseph Rochefort looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, because he hadn't. The basement of the administrative building at Pearl Harbor had become his entire world, a cramped, unair-conditioned labyrinth filled with code-breaking machines, intercepted Japanese transmissions, and the sharp smell of too many men working too many hours under impossible pressure. Thomas Nez stood in that basement at 9:47 a.m., along with 7 other code talkers who'd been rushed to Hawaii, watching Rochefort piece together the most important intelligence puzzle of the war. "The Japanese are planning a decisive engagement," Rochefort said, pointing to intercept logs that meant nothing to Thomas, but apparently told Rochefort everything. "Admiral Yamamoto wants to draw out our remaining carriers and destroy them. He's assembling the largest naval force in Japanese history. 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers. If they succeed, the West Coast is defenseless." A Navy intelligence officer interrupted. "Sir, we still haven't confirmed the target. The intercepts just say AF. That could be—" "It's Midway," Rochefort said with absolute certainty. "I've staked my career on it. And yesterday we confirmed it." He explained the elegant deception. Shapo had arranged for Midway to send an uncoded message reporting their water purification system had failed. Within 24 hours, Japanese intelligence transmitted that AF is short of fresh water. The confirmation was absolute. "Now comes the hard part," Rochefort turned to Thomas. "We know they're coming. We know when. Around June 4th. We know where. But the moment we start coordinating our defensive response using conventional radio encryption, Japanese signals intelligence will know we know. They'll call off the operation or change tactics. We lose our advantage." "That's where we come in," Thomas said, understanding crystallizing. "Exactly. You're going to coordinate a 3-carrier defensive ambush using a language Japanese intelligence cannot break, will not recognize, and cannot even identify. You'll be transmitted in the clear. No encryption devices, no coded systems, just straight Navajo. To us, it's perfect tactical intelligence. To them, it'll sound like atmospheric interference." The plan was audacious to the point of insanity. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged Yorktown, hastily repaired, would position northeast of Midway. When Japanese carriers launched their strike against Midway Island, American dive bombers would hit the Japanese fleet while their decks were vulnerable, refueling aircraft. The timing had to be perfect. Minutes too early, and American bombers would face a fully defended fleet. Minutes too late, and Japanese aircraft would catch American carriers exposed. "Traditional encrypted communication takes too long," Rochefort explained. "By the time coordinates are encoded, transmitted, decoded, and acted upon, positions have changed. You can do it in seconds." Over the next 5 days, Thomas and the other code talkers were distributed across the 3 carriers and their support vessels. Thomas drew an assignment to Enterprise, the fleet's flagship. His cousin Howard Billy went to Hornet. Samuel Begay to Yorktown. They drilled constantly, simulating combat communications, practicing carrier position updates, aircraft status reports, damage assessments. The code vocabulary expanded to include specialized naval terminology. Carriers became whale mother. Dive bombers became chicken hawk. Torpedo planes became fish eagle. On June 2nd, the fleet departed Pearl Harbor under strict radio silence, except for brief coded Navajo transmissions confirming positions. Japanese submarines lurking near Hawaii reported no unusual radio activity to their headquarters. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the carrier task force, visited the Enterprise communications room where Thomas worked. The admiral was taciturn, careful, known for mathematical precision in tactical decisions. "Corporal Nez," Spruance said quietly, "I'm about to take 3 carriers against 4, with the entire course of the Pacific War hanging on timing we can measure in minutes. I need to know, absolutely, that your communications will work under combat conditions." Thomas met his gaze. "Admiral, my people have kept this language alive for 1,000 years against every effort to destroy it. We're not going to lose it now when it finally matters." Spruance nodded slowly. See that you don't. Dismissed. By June 3rd, the pieces were positioned. Japanese carriers approaching from the northwest, confident and unaware. American carriers waiting northeast of Midway, hidden beyond scout plane range. Midway Island's garrison prepared for assault, their role to absorb the first strike and reveal Japanese positions. In the Enterprise communications room at 11:15 p.m. on June 3rd, Thomas received the final briefing from Lieutenant Commander Harrison. Tomorrow morning, Japanese carriers will launch against Midway around dawn. PBY patrol planes will spot them and radio their position to us in Navajo. You'll relay those coordinates to Hornet and Yorktown. Then we launch everything we have. The Japanese will be listening to every transmission, but they won't understand a word. They'll die confused. Thomas settled into his station as night deepened over the Pacific. Somewhere out there, 4 Japanese carriers steamed toward their own destruction, guided by intelligence operations they didn't know had been compromised, about to be ambushed, using coordination they couldn't decipher. The weapon his grandmother had preserved in whispered words was about to sink an empire's navy. 6:30 a.m., June 4, 1942. USS Enterprise, Pacific Ocean. The PBY Catalina scout plane transmission crackled through Thomas Nez's headset with crystalline urgency. Yego, besh wigai nakili daljini, dibe yasitsebi. Many enemy ships sighted, bearing 240. Thomas's fingers moved across the radio controls with practiced precision, translating the coordinates from the scout plane's Navajo transmission to tactical plotting. The Japanese carrier fleet, 4 carriers, 2 battleships, 9 cruisers, 23 destroyers, had been located exactly where Commander Rochefort predicted, 215 miles northwest of Midway. Contact confirmed, Thomas reported to Lieutenant Commander Harrison. 4 carriers, designated Whale Mother 1 through 4, bearing 240, distance 215 miles, speed 24 knots. They're launching their strike against Midway now. Harrison grabbed the internal communications phone. Air Group Commander, this is CIC. We have confirmed the enemy position. Prepare to launch all aircraft. On the flight deck above, organized chaos erupted. Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBD Devastator torpedo planes were positioned for launch, engines warming, ordnance loaded. The strike would consist of every operational aircraft Enterprise could field, a desperate all-or-nothing commitment. Thomas transmitted to Hornet and Yorktown in rapid Navajo. Toshe, CBE Tsostsid. Wolf 240, Hastian Tsostsid Nakit CB. Target bearing 240, distance 215. Howard Billy's voice responded from Hornet in 3 seconds. Hagune! Launching now. Samuel Begay from Yorktown. Position confirmed. Birds flying. The speed was staggering. From scout plane contact to 3 carrier coordinated launch, 8 minutes. Using conventional encryption, the same communication would have required 45 minutes minimum, by which time the Japanese fleet's position would have changed drastically, possibly becoming unreachable. On deck, the first Dauntless roared down the flight deck and clawed into the pre-dawn sky. Then another. The organized thunder of launch operations vibrated through the Enterprise's hull. But Thomas knew the Japanese carriers were executing their own launches simultaneously, sending 108 aircraft toward Midway Island. For the next 2 hours, those Japanese carriers would be catastrophically vulnerable. Flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, aviation fuel lines exposed, ordnance scattered topside. All aircraft away, Harrison announced. Now we wait. The waiting was terrible. In the communications room, Thomas monitored multiple channels. American strike aircraft struggling to locate the target. Midway Island's garrison reporting the Japanese air attack underway. Japanese radio transmissions that naval intelligence monitored but couldn't decode in real time. At 7:02 a.m., disaster struck. The first wave of American torpedo planes found the Japanese carriers, but attacked without fighter escort. Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire decimated them. Of the 41 torpedo planes that attacked, 35 were shot down, with 0 hits on enemy ships. Harrison's face went gray. "We just lost most of our torpedo squadron. Any hits?" "Negative," Thomas relayed from aircraft transmissions. "Total loss, no effect." The gamble appeared to be failing catastrophically. But Thomas continued tracking coordinates, monitoring Japanese carrier movements, updating positions to the American dive bombers, still searching through broken cloud cover. At 9:55 a.m., everything changed. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber squadron, found the Japanese carriers by following a Japanese destroyer that was rushing back to the fleet. He radioed position in plain English. At this point, security didn't matter, only speed did. Thomas immediately translated to Navajo and transmitted to Hornet and Yorktown's remaining aircraft. Whale mothers located. Coordinates. The precision of the Navajo number system allowed him to communicate exact position data in a fraction of the time standard radio protocol required. What happened next would be studied in naval academies for decades. At 10:20 a.m., 47 American dive bombers rolled into their attacks almost simultaneously against 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol was out of position, drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo attacks. The carriers' decks were crowded with fully fueled aircraft. The dive bombers struck with devastating precision. Thomas listened to the pilot reports coming through in excited, frantic voices. "Direct hit on Carrier 1. Carrier 2 is burning. Massive explosions, secondary detonations." He translated and relayed to Fleet Command in Navajo. His voice steady despite the adrenaline. "Whale Mother 1 burning. Whale Mother 2 catastrophic damage. Whale Mother 3 hit multiple times." In the span of 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were transformed into floating funeral pyres. Aviation fuel ignited. Ordnance cooked off. The pride of the Japanese Navy, carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, became towering columns of black smoke visible for 50 miles. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterstrike that found and damaged Yorktown. But by 5 o'clock, American dive bombers had located and destroyed Hiryu as well. In the communications room, Thomas transmitted the final assessment to Pearl Harbor as the sun set over a transformed Pacific. All 4 enemy whale mothers destroyed or sinking. The battle concluded. Enemy retiring. His hands trembled slightly as he set down the microphone. In 8 hours of communication, he'd transmitted over 800 individual tactical messages, coordinates, damage reports, aircraft status updates, targeting data, without a single error, without a single message, compromised by enemy intelligence. Lieutenant Commander Harrison sat down heavily. The Japanese were listening to us all day, every transmission, and they had no idea what we were saying. "No," Thomas replied quietly, "they didn't." Outside, the Pacific burned with the wreckage of Japanese naval supremacy, and somewhere in those flames, the course of the war had irrevocably changed. 10:22 a.m. June 4th, 1942, 4 minutes over the Japanese carrier fleet. The moment that decided the Pacific War lasted exactly 4 minutes, from 10:22 a.m. when the first American dive bomber rolled into its attack run until 10:26 a.m. when the last bomb detonated against the carrier Kaga. In those 4 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers transformed from the most powerful naval weapons in the Pacific to burning wrecks that would sink before sunset. But those 4 minutes existed because of the 60 seconds Thomas Nez spent transmitting coordinates in a language the enemy couldn't break. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's intelligence officer had been monitoring American radio transmissions all morning with increasing frustration. The transmissions were strong, constant, clearly coordinating some kind of operation, but they were completely unintelligible. "It's not code," the officer reported to Nagumo at 9:47 a.m. "It's not even English. It might be equipment malfunction or atmospheric distortion. Our linguists can't identify it." Nagumo made the fateful decision that the transmissions were irrelevant noise. His carriers continued their vulnerable refueling operations, unprepared for coordinated attack, confident that American forces were scattered and ineffective. That confidence died at 10:22 a.m. when Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers appeared through cloud cover directly above the Japanese fleet. The American pilots had been guided to that exact position by a web of Navajo transmissions. Scout plane coordinates relayed by Thomas, position updates from Howard Billy on Hornet, tactical guidance from Samuel Begay on Yorktown. The three carriers' strike forces converged on the target within minutes of each other. Timing that would have been impossible with conventional encrypted communication. The Japanese carriers had 72 aircraft on deck, fully fueled, armed, preparing to launch a strike against the American carriers, whose position Nagumo had only just learned. Aviation fuel hoses ran across the decks. Ordnance carts stood beside aircraft. It was a catastrophe waiting for ignition. The first bomb hit Akagi at 10:22 a.m., penetrating the flight deck and detonating in the hangar bay where 18 aircraft were stored with full fuel tanks. The secondary explosions tore through the carrier's heart. Within 90 seconds, Akagi was doomed, though she wouldn't sink for hours. 40 seconds later, Kaga took 4 direct hits in rapid succession. Her forward elevator was blown completely off its mounts, spinning through the air like a massive steel frisbee. Fuel fires ignited across her deck. The carrier that had helped devastate Pearl Harbor began her death throes. Soryu, the third carrier, took 3 bombs between 10:25 and 10:26 a.m. One detonated directly in the midst of armed aircraft on the flight deck. The explosion's force was so tremendous that it blew the aircraft overboard and ruptured the flight deck itself. Thomas, monitoring pilot transmissions and relaying damage assessments to Admiral Spruance, heard the awe in the aviators' voices. "The whole ship just exploded. I've never seen anything like this. All 3 carriers burning," he translated methodically to Navajo and transmitted to the fleet. "Whale Mother 1 catastrophic damage, estimate sinking. Whale Mother 2 catastrophic damage, estimate sinking. Whale Mother 3 catastrophic damage, estimate sinking." At Station HYPO in Pearl Harbor, Commander Rochefort received the transmissions and felt the weight of 6 months of desperate defensive warfare lift from his shoulders. The Japanese Navy had been stopped. The tide had turned. But the true measure of the Code Talkers' contribution wasn't just in those 4 minutes of attack. It was in the 8 hours of battle that followed. As Japanese forces attempted to regroup, as the 4th carrier Hiryu launched her counterstrike, as damaged Yorktown struggled to survive, every American tactical decision was coordinated through Navajo transmissions. The Japanese never adapted. Their intelligence intercepts from June 4th, later recovered after the war, showed continued bafflement. American communications unintelligible, possible new encryption system, unable to determine tactical intentions from radio intercepts. They were listening to clear, unencrypted tactical coordination, carrier positions, aircraft vectors, damage reports, attack timing, and couldn't understand a word because the encryption wasn't mathematical. It was cultural. By 5:00 p.m., when American dive bombers found and destroyed the 4th carrier Hiryu, the Battle of Midway was effectively over. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 men. American losses, while significant, were a fraction of Japanese casualties. That night, as the Enterprise turned toward Pearl Harbor, Thomas transmitted the final after-action report to SIN-CPAC headquarters. It was a long message, detailed aircraft losses, ship damage assessments, personnel casualties, tactical analysis. It took him 8 minutes to transmit in Navajo what would have required 2 hours using standard encryption. Admiral Spruance stopped by the communications room at 11 p.m. He looked exhausted, aged by the weight of command, but something had shifted in his bearing. "Corporal Nez," he said quietly, "what you and your fellow code talkers did today will never appear in the official battle reports. The program is too classified. But I want you to know, we couldn't have won this without you. The speed, the security, the coordination. It was decisive." Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Your language saved the Pacific," Spruance continued. "Remember that." As the Admiral left, Thomas thought of his grandmother, of the government schools, of the lye soap and the punishment, and the years of being told his language was worthless. It had saved the Pacific. August 14, 1945. USS Missouri, Tokyo Bay. Thomas Nez stood on the deck of the USS Missouri as a Marine honor guard while Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender that ended World War II. 3 years and 2 months after Midway, the war he'd helped turn was finally over. He'd spent those years island-hopping across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Okinawa, transmitting coordinates for artillery strikes, naval gunfire support, air attacks. By war's end, over 400 Navajo Code Talkers had served, transmitting over 1 million messages without a single decryption by enemy forces. The code had never been broken. Not once. Japanese intelligence officers, interviewed after surrender, confirmed they'd recorded Navajo transmissions throughout the war but never identified the language. Some thought it was a mechanical encryption device. Others believed it was a deliberately constructed artificial language. None guessed it was a living Native American tongue spoken primarily by shepherds and farmers in the American Southwest. But Thomas's contribution, like those of all the code talkers, remained classified. The surrender ceremony made no mention of them. The official histories being written credited radar, code-breaking, industrial production, and military leadership. All true, all important, but incomplete. The irony was not lost on Thomas. The same military that had depended on his language for survival couldn't publicly acknowledge it without revealing the secret. The same government that had tried to erase Navajo in boarding schools now classified it as vital national security intelligence. He returned to the reservation in September 1945, carrying secrets he couldn't share and recognition he couldn't receive. The government had made all code talkers sign agreements never to discuss the program. The code was being preserved for potential future use. Life on the reservation had changed and not changed. The same poverty, the same marginalization, the same federal policies that treated Native Americans as wards of the state rather than citizens. Thomas worked construction, did ranch work, lived quietly with the knowledge that he'd helped win the most important war in modern history while being unable to tell anyone exactly how. The silence lasted 23 years. In 1968, the Navajo Code finally became declassified. Thomas was 44 years old when he could finally tell his children what he'd done in the war. The recognition came slowly. A few newspaper articles, a military ceremony, academic papers analyzing the code's linguistic sophistication. But true recognition came in 1982, when President Reagan declared August 14th National Code Talkers Day, and the original 29 Code Talkers were awarded Congressional Gold Medals. Thomas stood in Washington, D.C., age 58, as government officials who'd never heard of Navajo culture praised the brilliance of using the language. A reporter asked him how it felt to be finally recognized. "Strange," Thomas answered honestly. "The same people who punished me for speaking Navajo gave me a medal for speaking Navajo. Makes you wonder what else they've been wrong about." The reporter asked what he was most proud of. Thomas thought of the ridge shaking under artillery fire aboard the Enterprise, of his grandmother's words about language surviving like water in the desert, of the 4 minutes that changed the Pacific, guided by a tongue older than any empire. "I'm proud," he said, "that we proved you can't break what you never understood in the first place. The Japanese tried to crack a code, but we weren't speaking code. We were speaking Navajo. That's not something you decrypt. That's something you have to be born into." He lived to see the Code Talkers' story become widely known. Books, documentaries, a Hollywood film. He lived to see Navajo taught in schools as a point of pride rather than shame. He lived to see his grandchildren learn the language freely, without fear, without punishment. Thomas Nez passed away on March 4, 2014, at age 90, one of the last surviving original 29 Code Talkers. His funeral at the reservation was attended by Marine Corps representatives, Navajo Nation officials, and 3 generations of his family who spoke the language he'd helped preserve. His grandson, speaking at the service, said it best. "My grandfather's generation was told their language made them savages. They proved it made them saviors. That's not just a war story. That's a story about the cost of erasing cultures and the power of preserving them." The code that Thomas helped create remains the only spoken military code in modern warfare that was never deciphered by an enemy. Linguists who've studied it call it one of the most sophisticated encryption systems ever devised, not because of mathematical complexity, but because of cultural impenetrability. At the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia, there's an exhibit dedicated to the Navajo Code Talkers. On display is a radio transmitter, a code vocabulary list, and a single sentence in both Navajo and English. "Dii dine bizad ye adailni." With this Navajo language, we fought. Beneath it, a plaque reads, "Some weapons are forged in factories. Some are forged in fire. Some are forged in languages that refuse to die." Thomas Nez would have appreciated the poetry of that. The boy who'd been punished for speaking Navajo had helped prove that the most powerful weapon isn't always the one you can see. Sometimes it's the one you can't understand, the one that sounds like gibberish until you realize it's been there all along, waiting for the moment when it finally mattered. The Pacific War taught many lessons about technology, strategy, and sacrifice, but perhaps its most profound lesson was simpler. Never underestimate the value of what you don't understand, and never try to erase what you might one day desperately need. The language survives, the code remains unbroken, and the memory of 29 young men who turned their grandmother's whispered words into a weapon that saved the Pacific endures.